The story of Rip Van Winkle can be read almost like an unconscious spiritual allegory when viewed through the lens of A Course in Miracles. Rip falls asleep in one world and wakes into another. ACIM would ask, did the world change, or did perception shift? Rip spends 20 years asleep in the mountains, but from the Course's perspective, humanity itself is in a kind of sleep, hypnotized by identity, time, personality, history, grievances, roles, and body identification. The ego says, this dream is reality. The Holy Spirit quietly says, you are dreaming. What is striking is that Rip does not experience the 20 years directly. They vanish. To him, the whole continuity of linear life collapses instantly. That mirrors ACM's challenge to time itself. The Course repeatedly says time is a device of the ego, a teaching tool at best, not ultimate reality. Rip wakes disoriented because the identity structure around him changed. Old authorities gone, familiar faces vanished, beard grown long, social order rearranged. Yet underneath all that, awareness itself remained present. That is very close to the ACM distinction between the constructed self, personality, self-concept, and the observing awareness, untouched by the dream. The ego depends on continuity of story. I was this. I became that. This happened to me. Rip's sleep interrupts the narrative. Suddenly the story looks arbitrary. The world he defended no longer exists in the same form. ACM pushes this even further. Every worldly identity is unstable because it was never the truth of you to begin with. Another layer. Rip avoids responsibility, conflict, and domestic tension. In ordinary readings, this can look like escapism. Spiritually, that becomes interesting because ACM distinguishes between true release and dissociation. The ego can misuse spirituality like Rip used sleep, withdraw from discomfort, avoid relationship, bypass responsibility, retreat into fantasy. But awakening is not unconscious escape. It is lucid forgiveness. Rip falls asleep unconsciously. The miracle invites conscious awakening. There is also a haunting tenderness in Rip Van Winkle. He awakens older, softer, less attached to the social machinery. The ambitions and arguments that once defined life have faded. ACM often points toward this gentle undoing. What if the things you defended were never your safety? The villagers argue politics when Rip returns, but Rip barely understands the divisions anymore. There is almost innocence there. The ego thrives on tribal identification and historical positioning. Rip's detachment accidentally exposes how temporary collective identities are. And yet the story does not fully resolve into enlightenment. Rip becomes more of an observer than a transformed being. He drifts into storytelling. In ACIM terms, he awakens from one layer of dream, but not necessarily from the dream maker itself. That distinction matters. You can become disillusioned with society and still remain identified as a separate self watching the dream. ACIM goes deeper, not merely becoming a detached observer, but remembering the dreamer is not separate from God. So the sleep in Rip Van Winkle can symbolize unconscious identification with the ego dream, passage through illusory time, instability of worldly identity, the collapse of historical self-concepts, the shock of perceptual reorientation. But the Course would add, true awakening is not waking up inside the dream with a different perspective only. It is awakening from the belief that separation ever occurred. In that sense, Rip Van Winkle is less resurrection and more interruption. A pause in hypnosis, a crack in continuity, a hint that the world we defend so seriously may be more dreamlike than we assume.